are still a long way from the Republican gubernatorial primary next year, and it is still anyone's race, but a relatively big name entered the contest last week. TRC Representative Rebecca Dow says she's in. And Laura, this was rumored and even expected in most circles. Now, how does it change the Republican contest, though, and potentially the general election for governor? What do you see here from her announcement?
Well, it's certainly interesting. I mean, we're seeing another female from southern New Mexico jump in, and it reminds me of Susana Martinez jumping in, although at this point, Rebecca Dow probably has a bigger profile than Susana Martinez had back then, which is very interesting to me. There's the potential to definitely get more support behind her, and I think trying to solidify some of those pockets of support around, well, not really pockets, it's largely solid in southern New Mexico. So the other folks that are in now, there's of course, I'm going to forget his name, Commissioner Block from...
Jay Block from Sandoval County.
Yeah. I was going to say Jerome, but I knew that wasn't right.
That's all right.
Commissioner Jay Block from Sandoval County. I mean, he's going to have some very strong connections in the metro area. But of course, you have to have that statewide connection. I'm not sure he's very well known in southern New Mexico, but he has the potential to raise a lot of money, as does Rebecca Dow. Rebecca Dow, I think, has a very strong backing from a lot of folks in the oil and gas sector, others down in southern New Mexico. So I think this really makes it an interesting primary. And it, of course, will be interesting if she ends up being the nominee, and then you have two women vying for the gubernatorial race. That could be an interesting dynamic.
Not bad there. Hey, Tommy, get the sense that Ms. Dow is the front runner some politicos think she is. I'm not talking about Laura, what she just said now, but, there was almost an instant, whoa, she's right at the front of the line, when she announced. Is that your sense as well?
Yeah, I believe that she definitely is a front runner right now. What I'm kind of looking at is, what are the key messages that we'll be hearing throughout this campaign, which is, small business recovery, education, infrastructure, and then which candidate is really kind of playing into that particular realm. And the candidates who have declared so far, I think Rebecca Dow definitely checks more of those boxes than some of the other candidates. Not saying that the other candidates don't. I just think she does a better job of it. I also liked what Laura had, that comparison to Susana Martinez. I didn't really make that bridge. So, I think that's a potential, but I think it reinforces what her place is in this campaign right now, which is the temporary front runner. But we have to keep in mind that, the official filing date isn't until February. And so there are many months still ahead before all this stuff settles down.
Good points there.
Start collecting signatures on October 1st. So that's a lot sooner.
Hey, Julianne, you're in a deep blue city, of course, not a deep red one. Now, from a campaigning standpoint for statewide races, is there anything you've seen successful Republican candidates do to peel off critical Democratic votes in your area? Is there a secret there for Santa Fe and Santa Fe County?
Well, certainly there are a lot of conservative Democrats and unaffiliated voters in the north, not just in the city, but, further north, especially where you have that sort of entrenched, people who are Democrats, but who align with the Republicans on some issues that become prominent in these types of elections. As I was making notes for this show this morning, I was thinking about how many months we have ahead of us of watching these GOP candidates on television with guns in their hands and babies in their arms, not at the same time, hopefully, but we're going to see both of that because of the, reproductive freedom issue and because of the Second Amendment issue that the GOP just, really latches onto for its core messaging. We've seen that recently, and I think we'll see that more. I agree that it's really interesting to have all these candidates. In 2010, when Susana Martinez emerged and went on to, beat Dianne Dennis in the general election, there were 5 GOP candidates that year. And then you might remember, too, that in 2014, when she's running for re-election, there's 5 Democrats who are trying to fight it out in the primary. So while it seems like a lot of names and a lot of heads in the race right now, it's not unusual for New Mexico gubernatorial politics. And I think it's a bit of a wild card right now at this stage.
I so appreciate that perspective. That history, as they say, echoes. It doesn't repeat, it echoes. Just from a point of interest, Jay Block was mentioned from Sandoval County. Karen Bodoni, Navajo CD3 candidate. She's in. Tim Walsh, you guys know him. He's a retired educator and also Gary Johnson's advisor. back then. And Greg Zanetti, who came out first, as we all know and announced, he's a veteran and a financial advisor, so the field is sort of in there. But I do have a question. Laura, let me start with you on this. I'd like to get a take from Tom as well. In fairness, we have to ask this. How vulnerable is Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham right now? Is the angst about how she managed the pandemic going to be impactful so many months in the future? Laura, what's your feeling on that one?
Well, I mean, I certainly think that that's going to be an issue for her. I think that she will have to have a strategy that addresses that, but focuses on the successes. I mean, the bottom line is, yes, a lot of people have had a lot of heartburn over the policies that she had, the closures, especially the impact to certain communities and just the business loss. There's businesses that still haven't reopened. But on the other hand, we also have seen a lot lower rates of COVID deaths than other states. And we still, we have a huge vaccination rate here in New Mexico, which is not the case in some of our neighboring states. So she has some successes to show for that as well. So I think that a well-crafted strategy to discuss that is going to be necessary. I think they're going to try to put her on the defensive, and she's just going to have to stay positive about all of her accomplishments and what that means for New Mexico long-term. So I think that she will have to address it, but I wouldn't call it a vulnerability. I think that the registration and the turnout still is what it is. It's still largely Democrat. Independents tend to vote Democrat, or have in recent years. And so it just really depends who emerges from that Republican primary, and then how they sort of square off for the general.
Important point there. Tom, still on that question, but when I think about it, if I'm Rebecca Dow, that's where I'm going first. I'm taking all the angst from the southern part of the state, from the business community, and that's how I'm launching. I'm going to circle Albuquerque, I'm going to circle Santa Fe, you know what I mean, and kind of build the anger movement, so to speak, and kind of keep that going. But is that viable? Can that really hold up all these months until Election Day comes?
Well, there's the primary strategy, and then there's the general election strategy.
Excellent point.
Primary strategy, like for Greg Zanetti right now, he's focusing on military messaging. That will work real well in Republican circles, and getting him a nomination if that's what the party decides. But on the larger scale, there's just not that much capacity. So you need a diversification of message. The vulnerabilities that the governor faces, includes cabinet turnover. Also includes, handling of the pandemic, but at the same, that those issues can also be flipped to a positive, to those who are supporters of the governor, in that, there are some who believe that just as much that it impacted negatively small business, with only 60% small businesses making it through the pandemic period. She can very easily point to the number of New Mexico lives that were saved, and the overall response that really made New Mexico healthier. So, there's, to every con, there's a pro. And, so pros and cons are going to come into play. It just depends what your perspective is of the current governor.
Let me start with Julianne here and take a swipe at the time we have left. Talk about what the big issues will be. Let's set aside the pandemic. Let's talk about the general election, what the issues will or maybe should be in your view.
I think there's one other thing to think about when you're talking about what the governor might brag on or what she may be vulnerable about, and that has to do with the legalization of cannabis. Cannabis sales are going to start in the spring of 22, a few months before this election takes place, and I think that there are a number of independent voters that supported that legalization effort, and I think that there are also going to be people on the attack who are kind of more crime and punishment types. So I think, we're going to see that kind of come up again. Speaking of crime and punishment, I think policing is a big issue that, the governor, frankly, has not addressed in a meaningful way during her time. And I think that the GOP candidates are going to have an even more, a different perspective about that than I think some of what the progressive voters want to talk about. And there's not a great degree of accountability for police in our state when they kill people. Their discipline records are not public, and there's a number of issues. So I'm hoping that issue, there's a little bit of pressure on that front. I certainly think we're going to be talking about education again, as I brought up earlier. We've got the Yazzie Martinez case ruling, where the state is really under order to increase equity in education. And I think that that's going to come up quite a bit. Issues about childcare and support for insurance systems and healthcare overhaul. I think, remember that Governor Lujan Grisham has a big background in health and in human services. And I think that that is also likely to come up, quite a bit during the election.
We'll see, as they say. We'll have plenty more time to talk about the race, but we'll have to stop for now. Now, this group is back for one final topic. What happens when tough on crime policies run up against the realities of the criminal justice system?